Okay, hello everyone. I think we'll make a start. My name's Sarah Viberts. I'm the interim CEO at NCVO and your chair for today. And I wanted to welcome everyone to what is the second event to share findings of the research project assessing financial vulnerability and risk in the UK's charities during and beyond the Covid-19 crisis. Just a bit of housekeeping before we start. This is a 1 hour session and there won't be any breaks. You may have noticed that the meeting is being recorded. So if you are uncomfortable being on camera, please keep your camera off. If everyone could stay on mute during the presentations and we'll bring you in at the appropriate time when we get to the Q&A. During the talks, if you think of questions and want to pop them in the chat, that's great. And a little later on, one of my colleagues will bring those questions into the discussion. So just to give you a bit of background on the research, this is a project that's funded by the Economic and Social Research Council as part of the UK Research and Innovation. The project is led by the Third Sector Research Centre at the University of Birmingham, with Southampton University and the University of Stirling as partners as well. So we, NCVO, are collaborating on this project, and we've got a really long history of working with the Third Sector Research Centre. Also, by way of background, NCVO, along with lots of partners across the sector, has done a lot of work to lobby government around the need for financial support for charities during COVID. And the question that often comes back to us is which parts of the sector are most in need? And so this research goes some way to start to answering that question, looking at the financial impact on charities from COVID-19 and highlighting variations and looking at patterns of vulnerability. So in terms of the agenda for today, we've got an absolutely great lineup of speakers. First, I will be handing over to partners, research partners who are going to take you through the findings. And then we have Anushka Kenley, who is the Research and Policy Director from Pro Bono Economics, and Roberta Fusco, Director of Policy and Communications at Charity Finance Group, who are going to give a response to the research from a sector perspective. But first, I'm going to hand over to John Mohan, who is one of our partners at the Third Sector Research Centre, and he will introduce the team who will present the research. Over to you, John.
Thanks very much, Sarah. It's a collaboration, as Sarah mentioned, between TSRC, David Clifford, who I've worked with for many years, Alistair Rutherford at Stirling, and the people who've done all the heavy lifting on this are Diarmuid, McDonnell and Alan Duggan, who are going to take you through the presentation in just a minute. As Sarah said, the aim of the project is to look at a number of different dimensions of financial vulnerability. So in our last presentation in this series, we looked at data on the pattern of reserves and how that varies between type and size and location of charities. Today, we're turning our attention to the dependence of individual organisations on particular income streams. So we're trying to get below the kind of headline figures that the Almanac presents tremendously influential and detailed data on, to get down to the variations again between type and size of organisations. So we're getting a sense of exposure, if you like, to financial risk. And before I start getting tangled up in the technicalities of that, let me hand you straight over to Diarmuid and Alan, who I think are going to introduce a recording of the presentation.
Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. My name is Diarmuid McDonnell. I'm a research fellow at the Third Sector Research Centre, University of Birmingham. And today with my colleague Alan Duggan, we'll be talking you through some of the emerging research findings from our work looking at financial vulnerability and UK charities at the onset of COVID-19. Today we're specifically interested in income dependence and diversification. So why are these topics of relevance or of importance to the sector? Well, the logic of revenue diversification is simple and, I would argue, compelling. So it allows charities to hedge against uncertainty and provides flexibility in times where the environment that they're operating in is quite dynamic or unstable. So the logic goes that charities that have more, diverse income profiles, so that's income from a range of different sources or streams. A charity gets a mix of donations, it operates, some trading subsidiaries, has some good investments, for example, so it has a couple of different income streams. If that's the case, if it has a diverse income profile, then it should be able to kind of ride or smooth out, the kind of the dynamism that's in the sector in general. So if donations are down for a given year, fundraising events are cancelled, then perhaps the money from their investments can help them, keep operating at the level they wish to do so. But also diversification itself is not without cost. So it brings, quite considerable administrative cost. If you've got money in contracts and grants, and you've got trading subsidiaries, and you've got investments, there's quite a lot of paperwork and administration and strategizing around those income streams. Of course, there's the genuine concern of mission drift. There's a good theory that argues, that charities are funded to do certain types of work, and that charities will alter their operations based on the preferences of major donors and major funders. That doesn't happen in all cases, but it's certainly a risk that must be considered. And of course, just because you have extra funding from a different source or a different stream doesn't mean that then isn't very unstable or very reliable itself. Diversification for the sake of it is not a compelling argument either. There was a literature review, quite a considerable one, conducted very recently by Hung and Hager, as we've seen here, and it found that there is a very real but very small positive benefit of having a diverse revenue stream for charities. This was an international kind of review, took data from lots of different jurisdictions, so it concluded that yes, it's a real thing, that diversification is good for financial sustainability for charities, but maybe not in a way that is meaningful or even detectable in certain circumstances. So we think we've got a really compelling and interesting case here with the UK. We've got some excellent data resources that we've been able to leverage in this project. We've got quite a long time frame, which is unusual for certain other jurisdictions. So we think we were able to do a really robust study of income dependence and diversification. So what do we mean specifically by these two concepts? Well, dependence is simply the percentage of total funding that is derived from a given income stream. So for example, a charity has a dominant income stream if it receives at least 90% of total funding from donations or charitable activities, or their trading subsidiary, or their investments, or legacies, etc. As long as one income stream accounts for at least 90% of total funding, we would consider that income stream dominant for that given charity. Diversification then is a related but distinct concept that we want to measure also. So it's the degree to which total funding is derived from one or more income streams. So for example, we would say a charity has a diversified income profile if it has the measure that we're using, and I'll explain what that is just next. If it has a score of less than or equal to 5,000. In simpler terms, what that really means is that a charity will have a diversified income profile if out of the 7 total income streams that we can measure in the study, it got roughly the same amounts from each of those 7 streams. Then we would say a charity has a very diversified income profile. And we'll see examples of this shortly. So where do we get the data? So it's a UK-wide study with the caveat that the Northern Irish data is due to be released at some stage this year, but the regulator as yet does not provide a detailed income breakdown. So we focus on England and Wales as a single jurisdiction, and also Scotland. In England and Wales, our data mainly relates to charities who fill out the Part B annual return. So these are the larger charities whose annual income exceeds £500,000.
So the Scottish analysis uses data from the February 2021 Oscar extract. There are 2,363 observations in the analysis, and all relate to account years of either 2019 or 2020. This provides data for charities with an annual income of more than £250,000, along with information on 5 disaggregated income streams.
So it is difficult to conduct this study on smaller charities, but towards the end of the presentation, we'll show you a data set that does allow us to look at the income dependence and diversification of charities all the way down to about £10,000 of income. So for England and Wales in the study, we have about 12,500 charities, and in Scotland we've got about 2,300. And what we do is we're interested in the onset of COVID-19. So we basically take their most recent financial year, which is 2019 for the vast majority of organisations studied. There's a handful of records for 2018 because some charities haven't filed just yet. And there's another kind of couple of hundred of records relate to financial year 2020, but they end in the 31st of March, so just as the pandemic was hitting. So we're really trying to get a good robust snapshot of the financial picture just as the pandemic hit us here in the UK. So the headline findings, if this is what you take away, what have we actually found? So roughly half of charities have a dominant income stream. That's in England and Wales and Scotland also. And so again, that's 50% of charities in the sector are getting at least 90% of their income from a single income stream. Is that related to any kind of key organisational characteristics? Yes, of course, the field of activity is enormously relevant, as I'll show you soon. And interestingly, organisation age is also quite an important predictor of dependence and diversification. And specifically, there's an age gradient where the younger you are as an organisation, the more likely you are to have a dominant income stream. And as you get older, there's a little bit of evidence that your income profile becomes a bit more diversified. So thinking then about trends over time, there's a remarkable degree of stability in these measures in the England and Wales and the Scottish charity sectors. And that's both within organisations. So if you track the same organisations over time, there are some changes in the level of dependence on an income stream, and there's some degree of diversification and concentration happening. But actually the picture is one of stability. So if a charity has a dominant income stream in 2010, it's likely to have a dominant income stream again in 2019. And of course that applies if we just look at the sector. So obviously over time, new organisations enter the sector, existing organisations exit, and we still see the same degree of dependence and diversification. So that was quite interesting, just how stable these phenomena were over time. So how do we do our analysis? Just to give you a good sense of what we were trying to do here and how robust we were trying to be. Basically, we posed the question, so how does the degree of income dependence and diversification vary according to a kind of a core set of organizational characteristics? So how big the charity is in terms of its annual income, how many years since it was registered with the relevant regulator, what its main income stream is. So is it from donations or charitable activities? Is it from legacies or endowments, etc.? And the field of charitable activity. So we use the international classification of non-profit organisations. So we're divvying up charities into education and training, culture and recreation, social services, religion, etc. For measuring diversification, we use a very standard measure in financial analysis. That's the Hirschman Index, which is basically you take the share of each income stream. So if donations account for 40% of total income, you just square 40%. If charitable activities accounted for 20%, then you'd square 20, etc. And you'd add up the squared values of all the shares of each income stream. And that gives you a value between 0 and 10,000. If a charity had a value of 0 on this index, it would have a perfectly diversified income profile. So it would get the exact same amount from each of the 7 income streams that we studied. If it had a value of 10,000, that would be the opposite. That would be as highly concentrated an income profile as you could possibly have, i.e. a charity gets all of its money from a single income stream. Of course, as you'll see in the results just now, there's a kind of wide variety of values in between. And we're interested in the median value of this index. So if we lined up all the charities from the ones who had a score of 0 to a score of 10,000, we're interested in the charity in the middle, because that tells us the typical experience or the typical degree of income diversification in in the sector. So that's enough explanation of all this. What does it actually look like as a result? So these are the results for England and Wales, but for Scotland it looks almost identical. So in terms of this income diversification score, we can see that in the sector there's a high degree of concentration. So basically, 40-50% of charities are getting, somewhere between 85, 90, 95% of total income from a single source. So for example, if you had a score of 8,000, that roughly equates to getting 90% of total funding from a single income stream. So for the other 20% or the other 10% of your funding, that could come equally from all other 6 income streams. But what this index shows is that there's a high degree of income concentration in the sector. So when we break that down by the different income streams, we can see how dependent charities are on different types of income. So we can class an income stream as being major if it accounts for at least half of a charity's total funding. So when we look at those organisations in England and Wales, for example, we can see that about 1/3 of all charities in the sector get at least 50% of their income from donations, essentially voluntary income. That also includes grants also as well. But the most common income stream that they're reliant on is their charitable activities. And that's, again, quite understandable when you look at the way most charities operate in the UK. So again, if you're talking about charities that get at least half of their income from a single income stream, you're talking about 95% of the sector, and you can see that 95% broken down by the different income streams in the top half of this table. Again, if we look at the dominant income streams, again, exactly 50% of organisations in England and Wales, the charity sector, get 90% of their funding from a single stream. And again, that stream is most likely to be their charitable activities.
And while there are minor differences between the disaggregated income data provided for the 2 jurisdictions, we've harmonised the figures to illustrate consistency in findings. So, for example, the percentage of charities reliant on a dominant income stream is not only remarkably similar in the aggregate at 50 to 51%, it also coheres very closely in each harmonised category in both Scotland and England and Wales.
A very small percentage, 3%, get it from investment income. So a lot of charities, and that will be the big grant-making foundations and a couple of smaller organisations, are entirely reliant on their investment income. So maybe break these trends down by our key organisational characteristics. So if we look at field of activity here, we can see there are very clear differences between the type of work that charities do or the type of sector they fall into, and how dependent they are on a given stream. So the education sector, we're talking almost 70% of charities have a dominant income stream. Similarly for law and advocacy, as I've mentioned, with grant-making foundations, they'll be highly reliant on investment income for about what do we have here? About 65% of those organisations, are reliant on investment income for 90% of their total funding. As we kind of move down the trends here, we can see environmental charities and those involved in culture and recreation are least likely to have a dominant income stream. So these charities, again, have a slightly more diversified income profile than ones operating in education, law and advocacy, international arena, housing, etc. And we've also looked at the other kind of key factor that comes out, which is organisation age. As I alluded to earlier, the younger you are, the more likely you are to be highly reliant on a single income stream. And again, this fits, I think, with common sense and logic. Also, that if you were to have a diversified income profile, it takes time to attract new funders, new sources of income, establish trading subsidiaries, etc. Yeah, but it's a reasonably stark gradient, I think, as well. So I spoke earlier about this idea that over time the trends are very stable, and we can see this here. So with the graph on the left, here are the percentage of charities in each year that have a dominant income stream. And we break that down by whether the dominant income stream is voluntary income or charitable activities also. And as you can tell, the key thing here is that the lines are effectively straight. They're horizontal lines. Effectively, the same proportion of charities in each financial year have a dominant income stream. And as well, if we look at the income diversification measure as well, which is complementary, we see the same pattern. So the typical degree of diversification is the same year after year. These trends right here refer to the sector overall. So this is just looking at the different, kind of basket of charities in each given year. Not shown here, but which is very, very similar, is if you take the same organisation. So if you look at charities in England and Wales that have existed, since 2007 and have filed every year up until 2019, you see effectively the same horizontal trend. So charities themselves, if they start out being dependent on a single income stream, they largely stay dependent. Again, that's at the aggregate level. There are some organisations that do become, quite, drastically more diversified in their income profiles, but they're very much in the small minority.
So this slide provides some additional analysis carried out using the Scottish data. These plots demonstrate sectoral consistency for income diversification over time, even when we disaggregate by charity size and charity age. These trends also persist when we disaggregate by ICMPO category, and findings are similar when we look at income concentration rather than diversification.
And if we look now at income sources, so today we've been looking at income streams. So this is the Part B form for England and Wales, and it's the monitoring information form for Scotland. These are closely linked to the charity STORP, so the SORP, the Statement of Recommended Practice. What that means is charities are essentially trying to, look at the wide variety in the sources and types of income that they get year on year, and they try and say, well, X amount comes from voluntary sources, X amount from charitable activities, etc. And what that loses out is obviously, where does the income come from? So, you might get a lot of money from donations, but is it donations from individuals? Is it grants from government, local authorities, etc.? So to address this shortcoming in the Charity Commission data, we went to the NCVO TSRC annual accounts data. So this is the kind of the underlying data that underpins the NCVO almanac every year. So in the almanac, we get this kind of good aggregate picture of changes in the level of these income sources over time. What we've done is broken it down to the organisational level and then basically replicated the analysis that I've just shown you. So for example, we'll ask the question, what proportion of charities, have a dominant income source? So again, it's 36%, so it's about 1 in 3 charities have a dominant income source. So it's lower than having a dominant income stream. And that's understandable also because there are a wider variety of sources from which charities can get their income. So if we break that down, we can see that about 23% of charities get their income from individuals in some shape or form. So that's either from donations from individuals, or it's individuals paying a fee to access the goods and services given charity. In terms of government, we're only seeing about 7% of charities in England and Wales who are highly dependent on government. So government provides at least 90% of total funding. So the income sources is a very interesting way of looking at this as well. It's not captured in the regulatory data. It's the work that NCVO and TSRC have done over the years to capture the actual annual accounts of charities and pull out the different income sources. At the moment, this relates to about 10,000 charities in England and Wales in 2016-2017 financial year. We should be getting our hands on the 2017-18 and 2018-19 income sources data pretty soon, and we'll be able to update this analysis also. You've already said this in your head and potentially out loud, and I can't hear as well. What about smaller charities who are equally as important to the health of the sector? As I said previously, in terms of the regulatory data, it's very difficult to well, it's actually near impossible because the data is not collected for organisations with less than £500,000 income in England and Wales and less than £250,000 in Scotland. So again, we can use the NCVO TSRC Almanac data, and we can look at smaller organisations because we do sample some smaller organisations' annual accounts, not to the same degree as they sample the larger charities, because the larger charities account for the vast kind of economic heft of the sector. But we do capture a representative sample of smaller organisations through the Almanac data as well. So if we have a kind of look at how smaller charities compare to the larger ones that we've been looking at in terms of their income sources, we can see some quite considerable differences, particularly for the charities that are £100,000 or less in annual income. So we can see probably, again, quite understandably, that smaller organisations are less likely to be reliant on government for most or nearly all of its total funding. So for charities under £10,000, only 4% of those rely on government for at least half of their funding, and that increases to 21% of the larger organisations. Again, internal sources of income are more important for smaller charities. I think this would be picked up if you think of village halls and community halls who are highly dependent on renting out the charitable assets or the property or the hall itself, and that obviously becomes slightly less important for the larger charities as a source of income. And again, there are some differences as well, not as stark as the ones I just highlighted in terms of donations. So smaller organisations are a bit more reliant on donations from individuals. They're a bit less reliant on charitable activities, and it's about the same for voluntary sector or the big lottery kind of funding. That charities of all sizes are kind of reliant to the same extent on that source of income. So it's a whistle-stop tour of about 6 months of work by Alan and myself and the wider team. So what key messages can we say at this point? So we can definitely say that there's a very high level of reliance on particular income streams and sources. So if we break it down by streams or sources, at least a third or about a half of charities, get at least 90% of their income from a single stream or source. And that's quite considerable. In non-COVID times, would we say that was, an organizational weakness? Probably not. As I said previously, a systematic review of the literature suggests that there is a real but very, very small positive effect of revenue diversification on kind of financial sustainability. But there's huge upsides also to having a reliable, dominant funder. You can build a deep relationship with that funder. And if that funder, again, is stable, then why would you then add to the administrative complexity of your organisation by trying to become more diverse in your revenue streams? The longer organisations have been in existence, the less reliant they are on a single income stream or source. So there is a little bit of evidence that as charities get older, they do tend to diversify their income profile or become slightly less reliant on a given income stream. And perhaps the one that was most surprising for me, but does fit with a powerful theory in the non-profit finance world, which is that these trends that we've observed, so the level of dependence and the level of diversification, are very stable over time. And that's whether we look, within organizations. So the same organizations over time don't tend to change, their income mix too much. They don't tend to become more or less dependent to any kind of measurable or meaningful degree. And then that plays out in the sector overall. So if we look year on year on year, even though we know the sector changes in some slight and sometimes significant ways, roughly the same proportion of organizations are dependent on a single income stream. So what would we say about the implication of that? Well, if we kind of have these, kind of ill thought through, prognostications that, the problem is charities need to become more diverse and they should be seeking further income streams. Well, that mightn't be helpful, or frankly, it mightn't actually be realistic. If there aren't new sources of funding targeted at certain different parts of the sector, for example, who are going to be hit much harder by COVID, then it may not make sense, because as we've seen, with 7 or 8 different income streams, lots of different income sources available for the last 12, 15 years, charities have tended to stick with what they know, and overall that seems to be a very sensible, understandable approach. Where do we go from here? Well, those of you who are key data watchers will have noticed that the Charity Commission has improved its data extract and its online database. So now we can get lots more information about the financial breakdown of not just larger charities, but all charities. So for example, we can now get access to the questions that have been asked about the amount of income that comes from government sources. That's been asked since 2018, so we can now get that information, and we have just started collecting it, and not in time for this, unfortunately, but pretty soon we will have an analysis of that. We'll be getting more NCVO almanac data pretty soon, so we can look at a longer time series of the reliance on different income sources. And most importantly for this project, so we're looking at the state of the charity sector, so to speak, at the onset of COVID-19. But what we really want to do with that is to establish a baseline. So half of charities have a dominant income stream at the point at which COVID hit. We're now starting to see financial returns be filed that cover 2020, at least the first half, and we're now seeing some financial returns going up as far as September 2020. So COVID will have taken impact in those charities' finances by then. We're collecting those annual returns now, and we're hoping to then see, well, frankly, we're not hoping to see any given trend, but we're in a position then to compare to the baseline to say, well, half of charities have a dominant income stream before COVID, and now it is 60% or it's 40% of charities post-COVID. Don't know. I'm really excited to find out what the situation is going to be pretty soon. So yeah, just thank you so much for joining us. We'd like to think obviously it's an important topic, but your critical comments just now would be very much welcome. And delighted to hear what you have to say, and thank you so much for listening to us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much to colleagues at the Third Sector Research Centre. I'm now going to quickly hand over to Anushka Kenley from Pro Bono Economics, who's going to give a response. Anushka.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And thanks to sort of John, Dermot and the team. That's, it's an amazing piece of work and provides incredibly useful context for understanding, particularly understanding what might have happened to charities' income over the course of the pandemic, and sort of looking forward to what the future might hold. Sort of as Dermot alluded to, we don't yet know what's actually happened to charities' finances through the pandemic, and obviously we won't know until we get that data, sort of in some months' time. Interestingly, the COVID charity tracker survey, which PB's been running with Roberta's organisation, CFG, and also IOF. And that's just a small survey, but the findings do feel quite sort of intuitively aligned with this research, in that in January, when we asked organisations what had happened to their income over the course of 2020, obviously there was a big chunk that told us their income had declined, but also quite a few told us their income increased. And alongside this, when we'd asked respondents what was happening to different sources of income last year, while most of those sources declined, so obviously earned income and trading income and fundraising events, some sources, namely grants from trusts and foundations and from government, had both showed increases. So that feels sort of quite consistent with the finding that lots of organisations are particularly dependent on one source of income, which obviously will have left some particularly exposed to fluctuations driven by external circumstances, as we've seen over the course of the pandemic. What I thought I might just do with sort of my few minutes here is just talk about a few of the practical issues for charities that this research got me thinking about. One is just that I suppose it's currently very unclear how the overall volume of income available from different sources is likely to fluctuate over the next few years, where quite different trends are going to influence what is available for charities. So obviously, you know, the budget announcement suggests that the government is going to be revisiting austerity outside protected departments. I think it was another £4 billion of public spending that was announced at budget. You know, so earned income or grant income from government is likely to be under pressure. And obviously the government's currently reviewing its procurement processes, so we don't know how that will impact contracting income for charities. It's also, I think, quite unclear what the implications are for 2021, given that foundations brought forward a lot of their spending in 2020 to cover the emergency period. Similarly, there's uncertainty about what's going to happen to personal donations. On the one hand, we've got this sort of general post-COVID economic fallout. On the other hand, you know, we've seen much higher rates of savings among richer households. And of course, you know, there might be further lockdowns and associated fundraising event pain if COVID returns. So whichever source of income and charities are most dependent on is probably subject to particular uncertainty at the moment. And that uncertainty just varies a lot depending on the type of income. You know, that uncertainty is driven by different things. So that does imply that the risks of depending on a single source of income are probably particularly heightened at the moment, depending on which horse you backed in that race. A second sort of practical point that this got me thinking about was timing of income, in that obviously diversification lowers their likelihood of facing a sudden cliff edge, but it also makes planning potentially more complex and less certain for charities. So, you know, consider the simplicity of having a larger funder or a government grant where at least you're very cognizant of the point at which that is going to draw to an end and the gap that you have to fill, compared to a complex suite of funding sources that might vary in quite unpredictable ways. And that could make things, you know, difficult for charities planning for variations in income. Another point this got me thinking about was this distinction about restricted and unrestricted funding, which is obviously another major source of constraint or risk for organisations. Someone said to me the other day, and I can't remember if this was from a piece of research or just an offhand comment that someone had made to them, but they were talking about a charity saying they would give up £200 of restricted funding for £100 of unrestricted funding, right? So there is a real value difference in these different sorts of income. And, you know, the pandemic has really enforced the benefits of being able to be agile and plot your own course and sort of move things around to meet demand and seize opportunities. And obviously we've seen lots of funders responding to this. So building on that, I wonder if this is a moment when we can really kind of think about ending this obsession with maximising spending on front line at the expense of investments that can help organisations build their capacity, their effectiveness, and to make their own decisions about the best marginal use of income. And it would be certainly interesting to know, and I'm sure the team can probably tell us, what the trends are in restricted versus unrestricted income and how that tends to interact with dominant funding sources. The last thing that this research got me thinking about, which John referred to in his introduction, is again just I suppose the folly of a funding model that emphasises small reserves, because obviously doing so means that organisations that suddenly find themselves at a cliff edge, if they're dependent on a dominant source of income, sort of really at risk of having needs left unmet being much greater. And in terms of future directions for this work, I think it'd be interesting, you know, to explore some of those things, but also I'd be interested to know whether there is evidence about whether those organisations with a higher dependence on single sources of income are more likely to shrink or go bust. You know, what is the actual impact of this dependence? So yeah, a few thoughts, but thanks so much. It's a really, really fascinating piece of work.
Thank you so much, Anushka. That was fantastic. I'm going to bring in our final speaker, Roberta Fusco from Charity Finance Group. Roberta.
Hi, Sarah, and hi, everybody. Thanks very much for inviting me along here. I think I recognise some of the names of the attendees, but for those who perhaps don't know CFG, we're Charity Finance Group. We are a membership body, part of the infrastructure bodies for the sector. And as Sarah alluded to in her introduction, we've been working very closely together with NCVO and PBE and other organisations in the sector throughout this COVID pandemic to essentially make the case and to track to see how charities are impacted. I'll keep my remarks kind of quite high level because there's so much of interest in this research, so much that we can kind of pick out, and I'm sure we will in the discussions later. So my comments are kind of just to manage expectations at kind of quite at the high level stage here. One of the things that I found, what found most interesting to reflect on right at the beginning was, what's the purpose of doing this research? And very much we've been asked by government, by other organisations, so which charities need the most help. We can't help them all, help us pinpoint where we need to focus our efforts. And I think that's the lens that government and others are very much seeing the charity sector through, and I think it's a flawed lens. We've maintained throughout from the start of the pandemic, that the impact on the charity sector has been felt much more in terms of a charity's business model than on its size, its location, or the cause. So there has been some focus recently from government sources asking us to kind of pinpoint themes and causes. And I think what this research reflects and matches up with other things that we know is that there is no one size fits all. We all know that it's a trope, but it's the business model that has a particular impact on a charity's financial resilience. And we talked a little bit at the beginning about how do charities manage their exposure to financial risk, and obviously CFG is all about that. Financial sustainability at the end of the day for a charity or for any other organisation rests in its ability to plan and to kind of have reasonable expectations of what might happen. Of course, diversifying your income is great, but it also then spreads your risk. So you have to manage risk, obviously, in various different categories. And what we've seen with COVID is that the impact on trading and fundraising and to the stock market and to gilt yields, which affects kind of pension liabilities, have all hit at the same time. So you might say, well, diversification helps because if one income stream is impacted, then you can kind of shift to another one. You can kind of spread your bets. But in this situation where everything was kind of hit at the same time immediately and for a sustained period, it's hard to see what's left, essentially. So we talked a little bit about grants and foundations. We know we've seen in this pandemic that grants and foundations have really stepped up to help fill some of that gap. And we talked a little bit about restricted and unrestricted funding. And we've also seen grants and foundations respond by removing some of those restrictions, which has been incredibly helpful. So I think we'll see some of that in the future accounts that we're going to be looking at through this research and through others. Overall, though, I think what this research says to me is that diversification of income isn't the silver bullet. It's not the answer to the problems of what leads to financial resilience. It kind of reinforces as well to me that the solutions that we sometimes seek to apply to the problems in the charity sector that are perhaps best suited to the private sector, sectors where you can kind of and entrepreneurial solutions essentially don't naturally fit, because charities have particular business models. They also have particular charitable objects. And as we've seen in this research, the link between the sector or the cause that the charity operates in is innately linked as well to its funding stream. So as we've said, there are charitable foundations, endowments. Those are quite fixed. It's be very difficult for a charity that is mainly funded by an endowment to start trading or doing public fundraising. So I think that's a variable that we need to consider when looking at the breadth of the charity sector and what it can do to maintain its financial resilience. Practical implications for charities. I think from what this research says to me is there's a bit of a danger in chasing the money. So you might say, great, if there are loads of grants for this particular thing, then let's go for that, let's move for that. But of course, that involves quite a big change in the charity's business model and quite a big change in the internal structures. Anushka touched on core funding or funding of kind of charities' resilience models internally, which is often difficult to find, and some grant funding is linked to, you know, shiny new projects. So in terms of building that resilience, that's quite hard to build resilience if there's always a new thing to adapt to or to deliver to. Implications for funders, think tanks, so on. That's one of the questions we were asked to reflect on as well. I think it's the resilience of organisations, of charity organisations that are reliant on funders and have been over the past, especially over the past 12 months. I think that's going to be an interesting thing to play out, where trading and fundraising has been curtailed and will continue to be curtailed in quite a big way over the next 12 to 18 months as we return. And as Sarah said, and I think Anushka said as well, we may have future lockdowns, more restrictions coming our way. So the crisis is by no means over. And the last thing I think I'd like to reflect on as well is the impact on local authority funding. So thinking about organisations, charities that contract with local authorities. There's a procurement green paper that's also out at the moment that many of our organisations will have commented on, will have looked into, in terms of the procurement regime, the kind of race to the bottom, essentially. I think that will have a huge impact to bear over the coming months. We saw at the beginning of the COVID crisis that perhaps those organisations that were contracting and reliance on contracting income for their main income were perhaps protected a little bit. I think that might change going forward. I think I'll conclude my overall remarks, and I'm looking forward to the question and answer session. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Roberta. That's great. We've already got loads of questions in the chat, so I'm going to ask Alex in the team to kind of moderate those and maybe read a couple out for John and the team to make a start on answering, and there may be some that bring Roberta and Anushka in as well. But Alex, over to you. Do you want to just kick off with one or maybe two questions?
Yeah, sure. I can pick up two questions from Lindsay Poole and David Whitaker. Both questions kind of around the relationship between income streams and then resilience. So Lindsay's question was around kind of which income streams, has diverse income streams helped or hindered with coping with the pandemic? And kind of which income streams have given greater stability during the pandemic? And this links to David's question also, which is, I think, John, you might have picked up with this in the chat box as well. In the paper, it talks about research from other countries that suggests a small but real increase in resilience through diverse incomes, through diverse income streams. Is that evidence available to share? And do we know anything about that relationship from kind of English or UK-based charities as well?
I'll start with that one, and maybe Diarmuid, who's almost certainly read the paper in more detail than I have, can add to this. So the link I shared, which is in one of the main social science journals in this field, Non-Profit and Voluntary Sector Quarterly, reviews 40 separate studies reporting about 300 separate analyses of links between financial diversification and indicators of the financial health of non-profits. These are mainly going to be US non-profits, so there are likely to be important differences between those and charities in the UK, particularly in terms of size. It is saying that the summary of the study says it's a small but statistically significant association between revenue diversification and non-profit financial health. Diarmuid, can you comment on whether they have tracked organisations over time? Because I'm just thinking of some of the questions that have come up, which have asked us about what's actually going on in the pandemic. And it's just important to re-emphasise that we're not really, with this data, in a position to say anything about that. Inevitably, the nature of the data and the time lags involved in it mean that we're just commenting on the period leading up to COVID. Diarmuid, is there anything you want to add there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, John. We're probably 3 months away, by my estimation, of having enough annual returns to look at the initial impact of COVID, at least on a subsample of the organisations we've looked at. So we're close. 3 months will definitely fly by, hopefully. In terms of the review of the impact of diversification on your financial health, yeah, so there were plenty of examples, plenty of studies which found a negative association, and when they collated all those different studies together, the average effect was small and positive, but there were plenty of examples of negative. And the size of the effect and whether it was positive or negative depended on the country being studied, whether the study was a single cross-section or they tracked the same organizations over time. So in one way, you can say, well, there's been a big review and the defining statement is that it's small and positive, but actually it varies by country and it varies by time period, which I think gives an impetus to what we're doing here as well. So we're right at that cusp of figuring out whether it's positive or negative for the UK charities.
Thanks very much. Alex, do you want to bring in another question?
Yeah, I think it's probably time for a couple more, which is great. So this question is from Victoria Hanbury-Madden. And her question is, does any of this work take into account the fact that some income streams lend themselves more to restricted funding and unrestricted funding? She thinks that one of the driving forces is looking at this diversity of income, especially for those charities reliant more on grant funding, for example. And perhaps I might take a second question here as well, if that's okay. So this was from Sue Pearson. Has there been any cross-referencing of income versus expenditure? So obviously some of the kind of statutory income, this is my comment, particularly kind of service delivery organisations, for example, the income has remained fairly fixed, the kind of static rates for a number of years. How does that link with kind of delivery and running costs having increased year on year? Kind of COVID has brought increased costs. Charities are routinely subsidising the delivery of public services with charitable income. So does diversity of income, how does that fit with increasing costs as well if that income is fixed? So I'm not sure where these might be best. So John, I'll hand to you, and you might know from other colleagues if you want to field those questions out to others.
Thanks, Alex.
Okay. I guess it's the fate of any paper that talks about disaggregating what are often very large scale aggregates, in this case of sources of income. As soon as you start talking about disaggregating, the response you get is, can you disaggregate them just a bit further, please, which would be lovely in an ideal world. But we do start to hit some limitations of the data on this. We've had some comments about the nature of certain sorts of income sources of various kinds, which may or may not be given to organizations for completely unrestricted purposes. And often these, and again, Dermot and Alan might want to come in on this, are really quite difficult to pick up, even in the more disaggregated data that we've got, and even in the very detailed capture of data from the notes to the accounts of charities, which underpins the work that goes into the almanac. You're very much at the mercy of the level of detail that individual charity accountants choose or are in a position to give. And obviously the larger the organization, if you want some real narrative about where all its income sources come from, you're going to have an awful lot of notes to your accounts. I think there's a suggestion made by Chris Dam in the chat, which was actually we can do a simple measure of the number of different types of entry that we find in the notes to the accounts, which gets us some way towards doing that. I think you're right, Chris. We could certainly look at that. We could talk about that. The question about expenditure, not as yet in this project, and it's something there's other bits of work we're planning. Again, it's we will be getting, as Dermot said, as the months go on over the next 6 to 8 months of the project, getting increased volumes of annual reports that refer to the period affected by COVID. What will be interesting about those, depending on the date at which the financial years of organisations, depending on the date of the end of the financial year of organisations, we'll get organisations whose latest set of reports cover periods in which some have spent a month under the post-March 2020 lockdown, 2, 3, 4, 5 months and so forth. So we'll get differences between them, and we might start to pick up differences between them in, say, the balance between income and expenditure, or perhaps in the composition of expenditure. I'm afraid I sound like someone whoever it was is supposed to have said that they couldn't tell the consequences of the French Revolution because 200 years earlier it was still too early to do so. I'm afraid that's a phrase that we seem to use rather too often in these sort of discussions around COVID, but there it is.
Thanks, John. That's great. Alex, do we have another question? We've probably got time for one more, if we've got one more.
So there was a question around, has there been diversification by industry, which is hidden in the kind of in the figures? That was from Ian Bruce. And also Nigel Rose had a question around, have we done the analysis by region, as availability of some of the kind of funding streams might vary wildly. So it might be that region might be too small a classification. It could be differences across nations. So a couple more questions on the kind of specific bits of data.
Do you guys want to comment on the regional angle, Duggan? I see you nodding your head there.
Yeah, certainly. Because we're focusing on mainly larger organisations with this data, they tend to operate over more than one local authority region. The Charity Commission only collects local authority information at a certain level. So basically it becomes quite unrobust to disaggregate by region. So you can say, you know, a charity is headquartered in a region and it is dependent on a given income stream, but that's probably not an accurate reflection of how the charity operates or where it does. And the same applies to the Almanac data as well, where it's a representative sample by size of the sector. It doesn't tend to be representative by geography. So a very, very interesting descriptive piece of work, but something that academically is kind of, yeah, it's difficult to stand over. The data just aren't collected for that purpose. So it's a bit disappointing in that sense. In terms of the diversification by industry, so we do disaggregate by field of activity in the sector. I mean, that's an interesting idea that within a sector, have they moved from being dependent on one stream to another? I think that is something we could take a look at with the data. Yeah, so thank you. That's a good suggestion.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to have to leave it there for questions. It's great that this has sparked so much discussion, but we're about out of time. So I'm just going to end by thanking John, Diarmuid and Alan for your presentations about the research. Absolutely fantastic. And thank you to Roberta and Anushka as well for your comments. Thank you to Alex and the team for organising today. And of course, thank you to everyone for coming and contributing. I hope everyone has a great rest of the day. Thanks a lot. Bye, everyone.